Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Witherslack Group, experts in special education and care. Enjoy the podcast. I am going for the second half. This is exciting. Having two parts is amazing. I've got Ross. Ross, how are you, fella?
Hey, Tom. Good to hear you. Good to hear Lee also. Is he the funniest man on the internet?
I've already asked him if he's the sexiest man on the internet. Now, he very crudely denied that fact, but I think there's a lot of people here who would. Adam is here. Adam, do you think that Mr. P is the sexiest man in education? And Joe, we'll ask everyone. He's keeping himself muted, Ross. Do you think he is, Ross? Do you think he's the...
I can't go with sexy. I'll definitely go with funny.
I gotta be honest. I must have been living in a cave or something, because this is all new to me, this sexiest teacher thing. So I got to step up my game.
Brilliant. I feel bad now that I sort of roped Lee into... Joe, do you think that Lee is the sexiest man in education?
I'm not sure I can go with sexy either, Tom, to be honest with you, but he definitely sounds like a man who knows his stuff.
Yeah, funny. We'll stick with funniest because he is funny and he's a great talker. Right, listen. Second half of the show. Should Ofsted be put into an early grave? Adam.
I'll start off by saying no, I don't think so. I think what would probably happen is if you abolished Ofsted, you would come back round full circle and accidentally reinvent it under a different name.
Valid. So what? So do you think? I mean, why do you think that though? Is that some sort of like innate desire in us to be judged or rated?
I think it's more just the fact that the public demand it. Essentially, I'm not talking about grading inspections or anything. I just the concept of having like an overseer of the education system, I think is probably really, really important. If you didn't, the divergence we get in the system would be even huger than it is now.
Now, you wrote a blog very recently. Do you want to talk us through that blog? You're correct me if I'm wrong. You're a science teacher, aren't you, Adam?
Yeah, that's my main job. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was just checking. I didn't want to get.
No, that's fine.
But you recently wrote a blog about sort of Ofsted and some of the issues there. Do you want to talk us through that first?
Yeah, sure. So it all happened when the aide memoir gate or whatever. You have to call everything a gate nowadays if it happens, and it's controversial, isn't it? So yeah, when they started releasing all those confidential training documents and they got leaked, it started making me think, why do we get like this? Because I'm old enough to remember 5 or 6 years ago when they introduced the new inspection framework, and the whole point of it was to try and reduce this gaming and this kind of lethal mutation aspect to the profession. But we end up there every single time. It doesn't seem to matter what we do. It's like Neo in the Matrix. No matter what he does, he always ends up back where he started, essentially, trying to make more money out of another sequel. So I was thinking that probably the only dimension that they never seem to change in the kind of current iteration is probably the grades they award the schools. And I think, was it Lee, Mr. P? He is right by saying, I think there is a tension that is created by the grades, because you introduce an extra dimension to the inspection that doesn't necessarily have to be there. And by doing that, you kind of raise the stakes inadvertently for heads to kind of game the system, because they're playing what's called like a synchronous game. So they're making their decisions as inspectors are being trained on what good schools look like, for want of a better phrase, but they don't know that information very well. So they're playing with an incomplete data set, and they have to listen to the whispers on the wind and hear what happened in a school halfway across the country, apparently. And they kind of have to be forced to pay close attention to these things instead of their own judgments of their own school, because the stakes for getting it wrong are just so incredibly high for them. It is literally career on the line if they drop a grade. If you drop from good to requires improvement, that's a hell of a challenging situation for a head to find themselves in.
Yeah. Ross, I'll come to you now. I'm going to hopefully ask all of you different questions. Now, Ross, I'll start with the overarching question for you.
Yes.
Should we abolish Ofsted? Adam said no.
Adam's got a very valid point. You know, you'd asked me in 2017 after my last school was put in special measures, I would have given you a different answer. But as you know, I've been working with teachers all over the world, particularly England, and I've got a bit more of a broader view, I suspect now. And I don't think there's not much I haven't researched on Ofsted as a result of them putting the final nail in my career, I suppose. From diversity to language used in reports and all sorts. I think at a macro perspective, you know, you've got illegal schools. You know, I don't want my child to go to an illegal school. I don't want yours. So there's a good 6,000 kids or so. Prison education, you know, our most vulnerable people in society, 140 odd prisons or so that need to be regulated. Care homes, 108,000 young people, I believe, you know, looked after children, etc. That, you know, even homeschooling, only recently it was put in legislation that we'll have a register for any child that's not in school being homeschooled. And I think that emerged from the pandemic. So if we take outside of schools and early year settings, Ofsted do a great service for the country. And I think that's something we should be proud of. And I never thought I'd say anything like that about Ofsted. I think another positive is, you know, 70% of school leaders currently are Ofsted inspectors that help complete the process. Obviously not in those other types of settings, but largely in schools. And of course, the welcome reform, the new framework moving away, well, supposedly moving away from data to more of a curriculum focus is welcome. However, you can see any school and every school now with a renewed focus on curriculum intent, which should have always been the case from the from day dot, essentially. I guess the negative consequences, in back to your question, should Ofsted be abolished? Well, you've got a capacity issue. Ofsted don't get enough funding. They don't have enough inspectors. Adam mentioned quite earlier, there's the gaming system, the consequences where you have this kind of perverted competition. You know, we are outstanding, we are requires improvement. You know, I've lived that life as a school leader. Ofsted acknowledge that schools work in different contexts, but they've got essentially a one-size-fits-all Ofsted inspection process. So that immediately isn't good for anyone. One size fits one person, although they are adapting an early years framework shortly. I think the critical thing in terms of grading, which is something I've pushed for a long time and reflecting on it a lot more, and we know the research is clear. If you work with a disadvantaged community, you know, pupils in the IDACI code, so if you're familiar with the Index for Deprivation and Child Index, if you work with high proportion of pupil premium kids, then your school's more likely to get requires improvement or inadequate. And then having researched all the secretaries of state, and I stopped bothering doing this 7 or 8 months ago when we got so many different secretaries, but I used to investigate what schools they visited, and essentially if you were an academy or a good or outstanding, you're likely to get a royal visit. Otherwise, if you're a poor local authority school on a requires improvement judgment, you're least likely to get any kind of VIP visits. I guess the critical thing I'm saying here is Ofsted grades is tied into legislation, so you can dig this out through the government website. What that means is whether Labour or Tories or whoever want to abolish graded lessons, we'll need an alternative system so we don't have to have an unintended consequence like Adam mentioned. And even if it's debated in the House of Commons, it's got to get through the House of Lords. So I just think that's never going to happen in my lifetime, sadly. I mentioned Ofsted budget. That's pretty much it, I think. But, you know, I guess my lens is a bit wider. So I don't think Ofsted should be abolished. However, I think the way schools are inspected needs to change.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That was a really good sort of start. I want to give a shout out to lots of listeners we've got. We've got Jane, Inner Drive, Noreen, Chris, welcome, Nathan, Mrs. Lloyd, who listens to a lot of TTR stuff, so welcome to you. Shaniqua's here, Gareth. We've got Kojo, Paul, Zoe, Mick, Mr. Patch. We've got Smart Curriculum, Mrs. Hinsky. Good evening to you. And the final person on that line is Peter, and we've got another 25 people in addition. So thanks very much for tuning in. Joe, are you there?
I am, Tom, yeah.
Good evening. I feel like I've like the last 20 minutes, I've only asked you one question, which is Mr. P the sexiest man in education? So I feel like I've sort of wasted your time a little bit, but I'm going to come on to OFSTED now and ask you some actual, like, legible questions. So my first question to you is, A, have you had a semi-recent OFSTED experience? B, what was it like? And C, do you think OFSTED should be abolished?
I'm going to start with C, if that's all right, because I think before I came on here, I sat and actually thought about what I thought.
Yeah.
And in lots of ways, I'm still not sure what I think about OFSTED, because, and I think that's part of the issue, is that it changes all of the time. And I think that that's reflective, really, of what Ross has said and what Adam have said, in that idea that maybe they do good things. There are good things, positive things that come out of an inspection, about the framework, the focus on curriculum, the safeguarding, all of the things that they look at that are positive, and that we as professionals, we kind of completely understand why there's a need for that level of inspection and the inspectorate to be there. We want schools to be safe. We want them to be doing the best job that they can. I think that for me, the biggest issue with OFSTED as an organisation is the grading, is the thing that does the biggest damage to situations, to the profession, to kind of the way we treat each other as members of the teaching profession, that innate competition that is maybe set up, the impact that those grades have. And part of me sort of thinks about all of the stuff that school leaders have to do, all of the stuff that teachers do, all of the stuff that support staff do within schools. We're always talking about, as a profession, about knowing your kids and knowing your school, knowing your context, knowing those things that you've got your finger on the pulse of your school. And as a result of that, I often wonder whether we put a lot of store into something like the SEF, whatever we want to call it in a school, whether it's a SEF, school development plan, and all of those things that we do. And part of me wonders whether the inspectorate wouldn't be more successful if, rather than giving schools judgments on categories like leadership and management, like quality of education, that they actually just decided whether, as leaders, a school knew itself, that it knew its strengths and it knew its areas of development, and it had a clear plan of how it was going to move things forward and change things, how it was going to do those things. It might not be that the capacity was there, the finance was there, the knowledge was there, but that idea of then how you're going to access support, what sorts of things need to change about your school to do what's best for your children. And in a lot of ways, I think that the grading is where things go wrong with OFSTED, because, you know, it gets broken down. It's that overall grade, so you can be a good school, an outstanding school, but the report then gets down to the smaller elements, and how can a school be good if it doesn't have a good in this? How can it be good in this area or that area if it doesn't have this particular element of it? Because we are quite harsh on ourselves as professionals, but we're also quite harsh on each other sometimes. And we are always looking for the things that weren't quite so good as they could have been. And that tendency, I think, to focus on the negatives is made worse by an inspectorate that insists on grading elements, and you can never get the nuances of every last bit of that inspection in those reports. You can't get what they meant or what it was like at the time or what little things happened. They never come across in a report, and those grades, that's all anybody looks at. I notice a lot of the time on Twitter, we talk an awful lot, don't we, about when we mark kids' work. Should we give them a grade or not? Should we give them a mark out of 20 or whatever or not? Or should we just concentrate on the feedback? And the very thing that as professionals we kind of try and take a step back away from. And do we want to give kids grades because they'll only focus on the number, they'll only focus on the letter or whatever else it might be? We do exactly the same in terms of our own inspectorate. And I think that's the part that frustrates me.
Wow. Yeah, really good sort of summary. I mean, Adam, obviously Joe's talked there about gradings. I wondered, just on the issue of sort of your career inspection experiences, have they been positive? I mean, my question to all of you was going to be, do Ofsted actually improve teaching and learning? Do they actually have a net positive effect on the profession? Adam, that's kind of to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer to that part, first of all, would be to ask people, how many times have they marked books this last fortnight, given the books back out to the students, had them act on all the feedback, taken the books back in with a third colour and ticked it all off. Because I think the current inspection framework did achieve one thing, hopefully, across the system, which is maybe squash some of the mistakes the previous inspection framework made, which is, I suppose, a bit about my history of it. I think Ofsted are a huge lever in the system. They have the ability to make huge changes. So, for example, there is no doubt in my mind that their focus on curriculum now has made teachers much more aware of the curriculum as a kind of journey and the ideas of different ways of assessing, and brought those areas to the forefront. And you can see that in the discourse that happens through Twitter in terms of people sharing their ideas about what the sequencing is like in their subject, and especially in the primary sector where they have so many subjects to juggle in such a limited amount of time. I think that's probably been really beneficial. My personal experience with Ofsted is quite substantial. I've been teaching 19 years, and I think I was 3 months into my NQT year when my school got put in special measures.
Your profile picture looks far too fresh for 19 years, mate. You really do. You're looking far too good for that amount of time in the classroom.
Maybe I have title of youngest looking teacher then. It's the secret of black and white, mate. It's the secret of black and white.
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
It's all actually been artificially coloured. It's all grey, that hair.
Yeah.
I got a biro and I just coloured it in before I took the photo.
Lovely.
Yeah, so I think I've always worked in predominantly white working class coastal regions on the south coast, so quite tough nuts to crack educationally.
Yeah.
So I've been through special measures. I quite enjoyed special measures when I was a young teacher, because I got to meet an inspector.
Man.
I got to meet an inspector every 6 weeks to actually learn something from them. Whereas before they kind of fly by, tell you what to do, give you 10 minutes feedback, and you won't see one for 5 years. Well, I had people turning up every 6 weeks going, do this, do that. And I think especially back then, when there wasn't really a culture of kind of learning walks and kind of continual professional development, that was really useful.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I know one of the criticisms I've seen of Ofsted, and it's certainly something I've personally said before, is this idea of like Ofsted as a school, as a genuine school improvement lever. Imagine, okay, so I've worked in a school that was in special measures, rated inadequate, like you, and I can't say that I think that was more detrimental for the staff there than not, but more because I have to say that it was more because of the sort of the reaction to that judgment can be to pile on more pressure, can be to make things harder for the sort of ordinary classroom teacher. Rather than, as what you say, which is okay, if a school is rated inadequate, special measures, they get regular visits, they get more inspections, they get regular check-ins, etc., etc. But the flip side of that is, when during that period, do leaders crank up the pressure? Does it actually lead to more difficulties for the staff in the school?
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. I was thinking back now, because it takes me a little while to think back that far. And I think we probably went through 3 heads in 5 years during that point in time. And you know, you look back and you think there were very valid reasons. Their decision was not wrong. Like, we had major issues that we needed to address. But it's also, very hard to create the climate to address those things sometimes in some context. So you end up, burning through a lot of people to get to the point where you've got the right person in the right role with the right money available to kind of make the changes that are needed to get that school turned around.
Yeah, absolutely. Ross, what are your thoughts on this whole issue of gradings and the impact of an Ofsted inspection? I mean, again, it sort of comes back to my question, which was, does Ofsted have a net positive effect on the profession?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to say, I'm going to steal that little trick from Adam. I have a black and white picture. He looks very young. So I've done 9 inspections. My last one, or I guess the one before that, 2014-ish time. At the time, the framework said that if you had, for example, requires improvement graded for teaching and learning or data, or whatever it might be, but had good leadership, it suggested to Ofsted that the leadership team could turn it around. But so that essentially, in their methodology at the time, did not give the school leaders the support they required to turn the schools around. So I'd need to work out what the new framework offered and have to read through their very lengthy documentation to see if that's still, there's many unintended consequences. What we now have is, yes, there's been a shift away from data. As Adam's quite rightly mentioned, we've got rid of this whole triple marking frenzy. Ofsted can't comment on marking anymore. I guess what we've now got is this working memory nonsense, where I've published a book on memory. I've done a linguistic analysis of Ofsted reports to see how often it's quoted. And what you get is, you've got your curriculum plan. We have a chat about it. We go into lessons. We talk to kids. We pop into a few lessons and we ask kids various questions, and inspectors, in a kind of bite-sized summary, suggest that kids can't recall what was on your curriculum plan. So then we get all these loose statements quoted, and I've pinged them all out on Twitter, and I've had 1 or 2 former HMI reply back to me with some very interesting comments about what they have to do, what they can't do, and all those types of things. Your question on, does it raise standards? I think it's very hard to measure. I mean, there's tons of reports out there. Ofsted would always publish their own annual reports on accounts and inspections and things. But I go back to that question, and many people listening, myself, Adam, and suspect Joe, who choose to work in a disadvantaged community. Yes, we want high standards for all of our children, but in some ways, we've got a recruitment crisis. We might be turning away good teachers working in those schools. So you can see the kind of merit of a Teach First model, where they deploy teachers to certain communities. It's a good thing. Whether we should do that nationally is something that we should consider. But why work in a challenger school if the research is clear? You're less likely to be viewed favourably by inspection. The impact on recruitment, the impact on workload. There's research on number of hours that teachers do in certain types of graded schools. It's all there. I suppose when I think about the gradings as well, just to kind of finish, think about in the big wide world, we go to restaurants, we write Google reviews, there's competition out there to promote businesses. I guess it's the same thing for schools, and I'm not defending Ofsted gradings. I just think my wider lens now, outside of one school, it's allowed me to kind of view that, Ofsted's it's a public service. You, me, and everyone listening, at least here in England, pay for it as a taxpayer. So Ofsted doesn't belong to the government. It doesn't belong to the DFE or Amanda Spielman. It's an inspection service for quality of education. So it belongs to all of us. And I guess we're all our lives are affected by it in some shape or form. So we all have a right to whinge about it. We all have a right to review its performance, its accounts, which I've done on many times, and to point out the things that don't work well, and ultimately for Ofsted to listen and help us, that persuasive case for change to make it a truly world-class inspection system. But we all know that my head teacher was sacked by a special measures judgment. The trust took over. I would work with him tomorrow. He's one of the best head teachers I've ever worked with in my 25 years of teaching career. And that quote, Amanda Spielman, you couldn't fill a busload of head teachers after an Ofsted inspection, is just nonsense. The amount of head teachers that leave following an Ofsted inspection, a poor Ofsted inspection, we've got this bizarre fetish that our schools deemed requires improvement wherever, and we've got this multi-academy trust model where we believe we can turn things around by closing it down, putting a new badge on, changing the colour, and farming out half the teachers. It's just a deficit model, and as a result, our kids suffer. We spend more money, we waste Ofsted cash, and it's a mindless loop. So I don't know what the solution is, and it was a nail in my teaching career, and I've said it to you before. I will take it to my grave, and I won't rest until Ofsted does do something to reform how it grades schools and remove a lot of these unintended consequences, but not at a cost at not inspecting schools. And I guess as a parent, my boys just started secondary school, not at a cost where, as a parent, I don't know the quality of what's going on in the school. I just don't know what that bit looks like, and that's what I'm struggling with.
By the way, if anybody has a comment on anything that we are discussing, there's a little button in the bottom right-hand side with a little speech bubble on it. If you click that, it'll take you to the space, and then you can just reply as if you were replying to a tweet. And any comments you'd like to make, we will try to sort of read out. We'll pin it to the top of the space. Elizabeth has just made an interesting comment. No gradings in Wales. Interesting. It used to be with Estyn, but presumably there isn't any more, according to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, if you want to call in, then also anyone else who wants to share their view on should we abolish Ofsted, there's a little blue microphone in the bottom left-hand side. You can click that and you can request in to speak at any time during this conversation as well, or you can just tweet a comment and we will read it out. But yes, no gradings in Wales. We've had another comment as well from Sunny, who says, raise the question of who do you want to know the curriculum, the children or the teachers, because memory overload on students is a massive thing. Hashtag Rosenshine. Any thoughts on that? Sonny, I'm not quite sure what you mean. That raise the question of who do you want to know the curriculum, the children or the teachers, because memory overload on students is a massive thing. Interesting comment. I'd love to, if you want to expand on that by sort of calling in, then please feel free to do so. Joe.
Can I just chip in very quickly on that point, because it has become part of my doctoral research. I can't pop into your classroom, quiz a kid and have a true picture of their social emotional health, what's on your curriculum plans, what it looked like the lesson before, and what it's going to look like after I've gone. Inspectors do know that, but when you really dig into any Ofsted report, I challenge everyone, go to the working memory quotes, or do a Control F search, and just see some of the nonsense being printed on reports and published to parents. That's all I'll say.
Joe, I was going to ask you about this whole Ofsted curriculum drive, and I was going to ask you about, were you doing all this curriculum stuff before Ofsted started talking about it 2 years ago? Because I know Adam and Ross have both mentioned the curriculum drive and the work that Ofsted have pushed around curriculum. Were you still doing curriculum stuff pre the new framework?
My career trajectory has seen me spend quite a significant amount of time as a head of department. As I was a head of English for 7 or 8 years. And I think that teachers and heads of subject have always thought about curriculum, and they've always thought about what they're teaching. I think for the first time, we saw reports, the Key Stage 3, the wasted years, all of those reports that came out. I do genuinely think that it gave more of a structure to those thoughts and that work on curriculum that wasn't happening before. As a head of department, I can only speak from my own sort of personal experience like that, and also some observations I guess I've made from working in schools as a senior leader for longer than that teachers have always thought about what they're teaching. They've always thought about what they're teaching next, how it links into the things that they might have taught just prior to it. In terms of a full 5-year, 7-year, multiple more years than that curriculum, I think that the new framework finally allowed for the type of work that we'd always wanted to do, but we hadn't necessarily always found the time to. And it kind of gave us the impetus to be able to focus on that. So, for example, as a head of department in English, we'd always concentrated on, right, okay, what do the kids learn about? What subjects are they covering? What topics are they covering in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 in primary? And we might have known a little bit about SPAG and about phonics and all of those things, but we weren't necessarily really clear and really clued up. Transition has definitely improved. There's a broader understanding, I think, amongst lots of teachers in particularly perhaps in core subjects about what topics young people are supposed to know at this age or that age, and as they're moving through. And the same for moving on after GCSE. It's given us the chance to realise that GCSE maybe isn't the end point of everything for our subject area or for a young person's learning. And so I think that, yeah, those curriculum conversations were happening, those discussions, those choices were always going on. But I think the new framework did very much allow for a more structured approach to it, and a greater opportunity to reflect on why in English Key Stage 3 you have to cover, according to the national curriculum, Shakespeare plays and all of those kinds of things. Which play are we choosing and why? Why are we choosing that? And the option was totally stripped away. It couldn't be, oh, well, we're doing Romeo and Juliet in year 8 because they're going to have to do it again at Key Stage 4. And it became, why are we doing that? What are the advantages? What are the themes that run through it? What types of ideas can we discuss? And I think that was a real positive that came out of it, not because it changed anything. I think it just allowed us to develop in far more interesting ways than maybe we'd ever really thought of it.
Yeah, interesting. Adam, any thoughts on this whole, were you teaching the curriculum before Ofsted started talking about the curriculum? I say curriculum, you were teaching it. I mean, were you thinking about the curriculum before Ofsted started thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because people have to, otherwise how do you sequence it? So my background is science, obviously, and we have 2 masters to our curriculum, the one we want, and then the logistical challenges of trying to make sure there's enough equipment to do the things we want at the time we want to do it. And so we have to always, in science, you always had to plan out carefully exactly where you're going and what you're doing and how it links together. But I do think before, when I was a leader in the old inspection framework, the quality assurance conversations that were going on were much more about maybe surface features. And my worry, I suppose, with the current one is, and why I started writing the blog, is that I'm feeling a little bit more when I talk to people in other schools and on Twitter and that some of these surface features are kind of bubbling back to the surface as kind of, there's a lot more talk about books all of a sudden again, whereas maybe 2 years ago, when you mentioned books, people would be like, oh, well, books don't tell what learning's happening, do they? People are kind of coming back to them now as evidence in the curriculum. And that makes me a little bit nervous, if I'm being honest with you.
One thing that I was because we're coming towards the end now, And just before I ask you the final sort of couple of questions, I was just going to flag up one of our pinned tweets at the very top of the space says we're recruiting. So if you want to be part of the Teachers Talk Radio hosting team and you are a classroom teacher in any phase or level, any level of experience, Jo, who is here speaking now, is on the Teachers Talk Radio team. She does all our current affairs stuff. And she's absolutely amazing. So if you want to join Jo and myself and Nathan, who is adminning, and a few other people who are in the space who are on the team, then please do get in touch with us. It's not just hosting. If you fancy doing other roles with us, then absolutely do. We are growing, we are expanding all the time, and it's a really cool community space to be part of. So if you're interested, get in touch. Go on the website. There's an email address on there. Just pop us an email and declare your interest. We're really interested in anyone who works in the classroom or is school-based, particularly interested in hearing from you. Ross, last question from me that I'm going to sort of throw out to all of you, but I'll start with you, Ross, is if you had a magic wand and you could add something to Ofsted or remove something from Ofsted, what would those two things be?
Gosh.
Good, that, isn't it?
That is a very good question, yeah. I guess I would want it would be funding to add capacity. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think all
You've gone
soft,
Ross.
I've
what
gone
has
soft on
happened
Ofsted.
to
Yeah,
you?
it's weird.
Has Amanda Spielman visited you in a dream?
It's a wider perspective. You talk about the unintended consequences, ending people's careers. I'll fight tooth and nail, and I'll start swearing. But if I talk about the positives, like you mentioned, the illegal schools, prisons, care homes, etc., think of your most vulnerable child. Think about your favourite restaurant down the high street with no Google reviews. How do you know if that's going to do a good service for that child or for you when you go and buy a steak? So I think the critical thing is we need more funding for Ofsted so they can inspect schools more. Now, hear me out here. I believe all schools, colleges, prisons, care homes should be inspected annually for safeguarding. And I believe it should be a desktop check. So through websites, policies, a little Zoom chat, all those types of things that can be done quickly so that every year children are being kept safe and that we can be rest assured that schools have done all the legal stuff that they need to do to function. Then we get back to the inspection process where people visit classrooms, talk to kids, talk to teachers, but it's more of a high challenge, low stress scenario where it's developmental. And that's, Sean Harford talked about this years ago when I met him. We talk about a hub system where good practice is shared, not kind of done in secrecy, where if you're a good, I think the framework slightly changed, it's still a bit vague, but if you're a good or outstanding school leader, you can become an Ofsted inspector, get into the kind of inner circle and get the Ofsted memoirs and get the Ofsted speak and benefit from this back in your own organisation. Meanwhile, if you're in an RI score inadequate and don't have a track record of good delivery, you cannot be an inspector and profit from that system. So that's another unintended consequence. So in answer to your question, safeguarding checks every year, please. So more funding to be able to do that. I guess to take the away, I can't yet articulate it. So you're going to have to come back to me in a few years. But it's along the lines of how do we reform the grading system, at least in schools, maybe not for prisons and things like that. I mean, if you think about hospitals and how they're graded, but it's an enormous beast and it's tied into legislation. I don't think we'll ever get to a solution, but we do need to think about ways that we can remove the byproduct of failure that then leads to this huge attrition, mental health, all those types of things that just don't do the sector any favours in the long term. And then we have all these politicians and, dare I say, people within the school system ourselves peddling this myth that I'm better than you. Here's my outstanding banner. All those types of things that we like to shout about and pat ourselves on the back. But if you've ever, Adam mentioned earlier, one of my favourite career moments was working in special measures school in RI, because the rigor's slightly different, the ethos is slightly different, the challenge is very different. good and outstanding schools come with different pressures and different highs and lows too. It's a challenge, 32,000, 32,000 schools across the UK, but 25,000 in England. You can't have a one-size-fits-all methodology, so it needs to be a little more tailored.
Good points. Joe, one thing you would add, one thing you would take away?
I think I've said all the way along that I think the most divisive part of Ofsted ultimately becomes the grading element to it. And if I could take away not just the grading themselves, but the things that go along with that situation, like the competition that we have as schools with each other, the general sort of, the banners and all of that other stuff, but also the sort of the stress and aggravation that comes from working in a school that is maybe trying to hang on to a particular grade, that might be trying to hang on to good, or those leaders who are working in outstanding schools who haven't been inspected for such a long time, who then sometimes, unfortunately, experience the crashing change where that grading is somehow lost without ever really quite understanding where things have gone wrong, because it's been a slip that's happened over time or whatever else it might be. And I think all of those elements around grading are the parts that I would take away. Although Ross has swayed me a little bit with his restaurant review talk, and that concept that maybe there is a tiny positive around those bits for other people who aren't in it, who aren't in the education system. Maybe if I could add something, I think that the sort of the allowance that maybe all of the work that schools put in at any level, regardless of what their Ofsted current grading might be, into self-evaluation, into self-criticism, that actually maybe there was a basis around that of acknowledgement of how well leaders know their school and the quality of their plans to further improve and develop would be a greater part of an inspection, not the trite statements that we may be seen under different frameworks where leaders have the capacity to improve, which always sounded a bit of a shoddy cop-out to me, but actually an evaluation of the plans that leaders have schools have, never mind just leaders, schools have, for moving themselves forward. Because as a profession, we are hyper self-critical as individuals. They are always, if you teach a class and 90% of the class got grades 7 to 9, automatically class teachers focus on the ones who didn't quite get that measure, and we're hypercritical as a profession. And I think that if we had something that felt like it was, tell me about your strengths, as a school, and tell me about your plans to move it forward, and let's evaluate those together, that might somehow have a better feel to it, and it might improve outcomes. Who knows?
I'm going to read a message in from Becky now, who's written in, texted in. I cannot express enough how much Ofsted causes stress, upset and emotional distress to some teachers, especially those in a special measures school. I've been in a staff meeting where the head yelled at us because of the judgment and how he was told not to trust us as staff, but did, and he wished he'd listened to the person who told him. I'd have been in the maths department that were blamed in front of all staff for the special measures judgment. It needs a major reform because of the mental health toll it can take on staff. I've literally been speaking to my counsellor tonight about the anxiety Ofsted causes me, to the point one time we got the message we had the call, I was on the floor crying, hiding behind the podium in my classroom. My issues are linked to past trauma, but I know so many teachers who feel so much stress, anxiety and pressure because of Ofsted, and it's not right. I think that sort of view would be reflected by others. I mean, Ross, you've already mentioned in the past your experience, and I think others have had similar. So I think we're coming on to Adam now with your final say on this, Adam. I don't know if you've got any response, or any of you actually Ross or Joe or Adam have any response to what Becky has said?
I feel for Becky, definitely. Although my gut instinct is, what a leader, eh? What a piece of work that person clearly was to have that kind of behavior. I'm just thinking about trying to choose appropriate words that are recorded. But I do think, I think we're all relatively in consensus, the idea that the grades definitely add unforeseen pressure on the system. I was trying to think of something really tangible that I could have that I'd want the system to have back. And I got to be honest with you, if I could have one wish right now, I just have Sean Harper back on Twitter, because just having a mythbuster there that represents the central aim of what they're trying to achieve and preventing it getting diluted, so you can get firsthand from the top what should be going on. Because I feel like inspection is a very, very hard thing to do accurately. And if we had the ability to kind of have more checks and balances in the system on the inspection side as well, we may find ourselves under a lot less kind of running around with our heads cut off trying to make an invisible inspector happy, before they turn up.
100%. Sean was a real bonus to have on for exactly that myth busting, that you felt as though you could sort of ask any type of question or any weird rumor idea that you might have heard somewhere, whether it be on Twitter or in another school or whatever else it was, and that was addressed quickly. And part of me wonders whether if Sean was still on Twitter and doing that thing, whether those aid memoirs would ever have seen the light of day on Twitter.
I'm going to interject, Joe. I disagree. Sean did brilliant work on Twitter, but I feared for his mental health, because he was a one-man band fighting machine. And we must remember that half the teaching world aren't on Twitter. And you could have a school leader in one school representing the school Twitter account and all those, but it's not everywhere. So you have it, by doing so there, rather than through official Ofsted communications, there are again unintended consequences, just like you have with inspectors, that some profit and some don't. I
That's
guess,
a fair point, Ross. That's totally a fair point. Yeah.
I guess we all benefited from chatting to him. The privilege of interviewing and meeting him several times. So he did good stuff. But I think in the end, Twitter killed him, and probably I was also partly responsible for that, with all the Ofsted flack that I used to put out.
Yeah, I mean, I was always lovely. And Joe, you mentioned it was a bonus he was on Twitter. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned bonuses. No, I think I'm being uncouth there. I'm being very uncouth. But no, I think that to be fair, I think you've all made a lot of really good points, and you've certainly got me thinking anyway about it all. I mean, again, I think my question, which I have my personal view, is that the net, then there is not a net positive of having Ofsted in its current form. There is a net negative, based on the pressure on staff, the pressure on schools, the so-called unintended consequences, all the rest of it. My view is there is not a net, and that is my personal view, not the view of Teachers Talk Radio, but my personal view is there is not a net positive. However, I do think that you have all given a really good summary of some of the pros, cons, and some of the things that that Ofsted, that you feel that Ofsted could do better, or you think should be removed from them. So I thank you all, and thank you very much for all coming on the show. And I think we need to get Sean Harford on again. He was on with Noreen actually last year on Teachers Talk Radio. We'll have to look, but I'm going to look back on that show and see if I can find it again. But we'll have to get him back on and see what he has to say. But I think it was a really interesting chat. So thanks, Adam, and thanks, Joe, and thanks, Ross, for coming on and spending an hour talking it out. And this will be available as a podcast in 2 parts. This will be part 2. So we at Teachers Talk Radio will tweet it out when it's ready, so you can share it, listen to it, divulge in it. Also, if you've enjoyed the show tonight, you can listen back to any show on Teachers Talk Radio on the website, ttradio.org. And I have to give a shout out finally to Tracy, who has her debut show starting in 4 minutes on Teachers Talk Radio. Tracy is starting her show in 3.5 minutes, and you can listen to it live by clicking ttradio.org, listen live on the top. Click on that and then press play, and you can listen to Tracy live talking all things teacher wellbeing in about 3.5 minutes until 10:30. So thank you very much for tuning in. We will be live in 3 minutes' time. Thank you, Nathan, for adminning, and thanks every single one of you for listening in. Cheers all.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.